Welcome in. This is a segment from the Slumpbuster Fantasy Football Podcast with Aris Blakeney. Find the full episode on Spotify, iTunes, the Google Play Store, or our YouTube channel. Enjoy.
So now on to defenses. A defense is a defense. You're going to have really good weeks. You're going to have really bad weeks. You're going to go up against some of the best offenses in the league. Other weeks you might play, Miami and just start that team, whoever's playing Miami the whole year. But top five, we have Chicago, Rams, New England, Cleveland, and Baltimore. Baltimore still feel like they have enough players to be top five, but they're not going to flirt with that number one defense because they did lose some players.
Yeah, one of the tough things when it comes to drafting defenses, especially just year after year, in the last 5 to 10 years, only one team has been able to repeat as back-to-back top DST. That was the Legion of Boom Seattle Seahawks. Since then, it's just been a bit of a rotating door. It's very hard to predict. These schedules are constantly changing, and these teams are constantly moving apart, losing a piece here, a piece there. So it's one of the harder positions to project. I definitely do agree with Aris that I like to stream. I think streaming is really just the only real way to go when it comes to DSTs, just given a lot of their value is just going to be dependent on who they're playing in that given week. If you started whoever played the Cleveland Browns, for example, a couple years ago, you probably won DST most weeks. You really just have to consider strength of schedule when you're looking at these teams. Looking at that top five, though, do I see Chicago being able to repeat as the number one overall DST? And we mentioned this when we went through the division breakdowns. I actually saw them potentially taking a step back this year. And whether that be Khalil Mack experienced injury or the fact that they lost players like Adrian Amos in that secondary, there's potential for them to lose a step or two, especially when you play in the cold. Things are constantly changing. Players are constantly getting hurt. It's hard to project. At minimum, I could see them being a tough defense later in the year as the conditions start to get more unfavorable and they start welcoming these teams that aren't used to playing in colder conditions. In terms of the other defenses you mentioned here, I love having Cleveland in that top five, especially after what I saw from them in preseason week 3. This team looks scary potentially on defense. Not only did they only have Denzel Ward in that secondary, but they added Greedy Williams. Myles Garrett is still doing a lot of work down there on the defensive line. This team could have the biggest blow-up potential week to week. So I like them. And the bright spot of their schedule, too, is they face Cincinnati couple weeks a year. I could see them very easily being able to shut down Baltimore's defense a couple times a year, or Baltimore's offense a couple times a year. Their only real tough matchup in division is having played the Steelers twice.
Yeah, they had 5 sacks in the first quarter against Tampa Bay. That's 5 points right there in the first quarter. They didn't let up any points, so that's good. Once their twos came in, then holes started to pop off. But yeah, they also added Olivier Vernon, who's a really good edge rusher, paired with Myles Garrett. Who do you double team on that offensive line? Somebody's always going to get single coverage on that offensive line. They're going to be able to pop off and get to the quarterback pretty quickly, which is going to put pressure on the quarterback to throw the ball, and then Greedy Williams and Denzel Ward back there just getting ready to just steal the ball. So I do like Cleveland in this top 5, and them finishing 21 last year. It's going to be a huge boost to their confidence. And, they're going to be playing some big-time games this year, so, we'll see how they actually hold up. All right, so in the next group, we have New Orleans, Chargers, Kansas City, Philadelphia, and Minnesota. Minnesota's been good for the last couple of years. Chargers have started to emerge as the top defense in the league. Where do you see these guys falling out?
Well, Minnesota has been one of the better real-life NFL defenses, but as a fantasy performing defense, the points haven't necessarily been there in their favor. And the problem with DST scoring is a lot of those points are going to be in terms of the big plays, the turnovers, the pick sixes and stuff like that. And if you're looking at a team like Kansas City, last year, a lot of those went in their favor. Now, again, going back to kind of the real-life dynamics, Kansas City was one of the worst defenses in the league. However, because they were able to make a few big plays happen, were one of the better sack teams in the league, Kansas City really blew up as a DST. Do I think they'll be able to maintain that same production? Probably not, even though I do think that they'll be better in terms of the real game itself. I don't necessarily think that they'll be one of the better fantasy teams like they were. New Orleans, I think you're counting on sacks. They were one of the better run defenses last year. But again, it's just so hard to predict the big plays when it comes to talking about DSTs. Like, they're such a fluky statistic. It really depends on week to week who they're playing. Probably the safest choice I'm going to throw out there is going to be Philly. I think Philly is going to be able to produce at a level adequate enough to at least get you a baseline amount of points week to week. And if they do throw on a big play at the end of the week, it's going to be gravy.
Yeah, I do think that as well. They're going to be pretty consistent. Bias here, the Chargers defense, they had a lot of turnovers last year, but unfortunately they let up a lot of points. So you're going to have to, die by the sword, live by the sword with them. But yeah, Philadelphia definitely is going to be the most consistent out of this group. We're not going to go top 25 on defense. Just, give me a couple interesting defenses that you still see out there. I still see Jacksonville. Tennessee was really good in the red zone last year. And then Atlanta, with getting some of their defensive players healthy, could pop off this year as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I love the Jacksonville slid. Like, it's amazing when you look at just how narratives have changed so much. So coming off of that year, they went to the AFC Championship game just last year. People were snagging Jacksonville way too high, going out of their way to pick up Saxonville, as they were called. But now that they had one down year, their value has dropped significantly. This year, they're going to be playing a last place schedule. This team can return to where it was a couple years ago. Who knows what necessarily big plays are going to produce, if they're going to be able to be Saxonville again. But at minimum, they're a good late-round flyer to take on defense. And probably my favorite, and again, not to show my bias here, but I love the Niners as a potential late-round DST. And why I say that is, year to year, again, turnovers are hard to predict. This team had only 2 interceptions last year. I think that just regression to the mean in a positive way is something to consider with this team. And then when you factor in the improvements they've made to this defense, especially on the defensive line, they're going to cause a lot of havoc for a lot of quarterbacks this year. And there's some value in that. And I think potentially they could take a big turnaround. Certainly, I do project them as a real-life top 10 defense. Whether that turns into fantasy points or not is going to be hard to say. I also want to point out Buffalo, too. Buffalo has been a strong DST. Doug McDermott really does a great job with that team. And there's some playmakers out there that can surprise you. And definitely, we talked about what helps Chicago is their ability to play in cold weather. And when teams start going there later in the year, Buffalo could also be in that same regard.
Yeah, the one defense that I think is going to regress pretty heavily is going to be Denver, just because they're bringing in a new defensive, they brought in a new coach, a new scheme. And typically when you switch schemes the first year, you have a noticeable drop off. But then that second year with most of those players in the scheme, they all understand where they should go, what to do when this happens. Then they boost up. So they finished 5 last year. I think they're going to fall down a little bit this year. But then the following year, they're going to jump right back up, especially because Fangio came from Chicago. He has that top defense already in his back pocket. They're going to learn it this year. It's going to be difficult. They're going to make mistakes. But then the second year, they're going to skyrocket in the draft.
Absolutely. I think that does it for me on DSTs.
Yeah, same here. Not much we can really talk about them. And now kicker. Let's go to the top 32 kickers. Let's just break down every single one. No, just kidding. Pretty much kicker, you're going to pick a kicker on a good offense. The offense is constantly moving the ball, getting into the red zone, scoring touchdowns. That kicker is going to have opportunities to score you points. You don't want a kicker on a bad offense that's constantly punting or can't get over the 50. You just want to get a kicker on a good team. That's really how to draft a kicker. Most people reach for people like Zuerlein and Tucker, but I usually wait till the very end of my draft to pick a kicker. How do you feel about kickers, Juju?
My thought on it is, first off, if you are not taking a kicker in the last round, what are you doing? Baby, what are you doing? Because seriously, the difference between Zuerlein and the next kicker up is so arbitrary, like a point differential. It's just not worth it. So stop doing it. You're really doing yourself a disservice. And I think your family's even a little bit embarrassed for you. But moving on just to kickers as a whole, there's an interesting debate going on in the fantasy community as far as should we even keep this position around anymore? And one of the counter arguments I hear a lot is, well, fantasy is based off the real game. There's kickers in the real game, so we have to be able to mimic that aspect. But when you talk about fantasy, again, I talk to the noticeable lack of distinction from a kicker week to week. Pretty much as long as you're not starting someone who's injured or on bye week, you're good. And that's really the only legit strategy that is considered when picking a kicker is, are they healthy and playing? It's not like you go out of your way to check the weather reports. You don't check the field conditions to make sure the grass was properly sodded. And unless they have a known injury, you're not keeping updates on if your kicker's healthy or not, really. I think I'm starting to get to the point where I'm over this position being a thing. Maybe I'm spiteful from a kicker facing me and having five kicks against me or something like that. But it's just dumb luck, and you're just, again, throwing darts when you pick this position.
See, and I'm going to take the complete opposite. I think you should keep kickers in the game. It's part of the game in there. But in the later weeks of the season, when you're playing in Buffalo with 17 inches of snow, like Adam Vinatieri did last year, or you're playing inside of a dome, that does benefit you at the kicker position. I'm going to go even one more. We should add punters to the league and go based off of their, hang time. And if they pin them in the 10 or 20 yards, give them some more points. Let's bring on freaking punters into the fantasy football.
Okay. Stop it. Stop what you're doing. No.
For the brand.
So if we do count tackles, I'll take hardest hitting tackles for a punter. I will take my guy, Mr. Mike Wisnowski. Shout out to you. Love that highlight against Denver. But just in terms of the debate, this ongoing debate on keeping kickers, I like my leagues when players are more engaged. And whenever I think about players not really having to put much thought into this position, it just kind of disinterests me too, because again, I'm not even putting much thought into it. I'm just like, does this guy exist? That's all I'm fine with. I would say, honestly, a route that I would suggest to a lot of teams, a lot of leagues to consider is, instead of going with kicker, consider individual defensive player if you really want to incorporate more aspects of real life football into your game. Being able to keep track of the other side of the ball, like consistently week to week, monitor people's sacks, tackle numbers. That actually keeps you engaged more than, does this guy play on an NFL team and can he make this kick? If you really want to have more in-depth fantasy experience, I would suggest that as an alternative to standard kickers being a position in your league.
Yeah, I can see that where you're starting to draft, defensive players. You got to, 2 slots for DB, 2 slots for linebacker, 2 slots for D-line, and you're going based off of, pick, sacks, tackles, forced fumbles. That would actually be a fun little, league to try out one time. I've never seen one like that.
Actually, fun fact, so we were talking about recording like our live draft next week. The league we're going to be drafting in next week is going to be a 14-team, half-point PPR, individual defensive player league. So if you start hearing Luke Kuechly got drafted, no, it was not a mistake. That was actually intentional. And hopefully, more players consider it as a long-term alternative. Maybe if you don't necessarily even start with 2 DB slots, 2 linebacker slots or stuff like that, just consider adding an individual defensive player spot to your league. And I think you'll be impressed at kind of how it adds another unique dynamic to your week-to-week thought process.
As long as they get points for offensive touchdowns, J.J. Watt is going to be a star. Dontari Poe with his jump pass is going to be a star. But, yeah, that's going to be a pretty interesting. I've never done a league where defense is on there, so that's going to be a fun experience for me and the listeners to go through your draft with you guys.